Hi, everybody. Come on in, make yourself comfortable. We'll get started in about 1 minute's time. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Come on in, make yourself comfortable. We'll kick off in about 30 seconds. All right, looks like most people are ready to go. So welcome to our webinar on the money sandwich. My name is Jeff Thurek. I'm a director of Evalesco, and I'm really excited today to be joined by my friend, colleague, and esteemed author, Marc Bineham. So welcome and thanks for joining us, Marc.
Thank you for inviting me, Jeff. It's good to be here.
And congratulations on your new book, The Money Sandwich, which I'll hold up and give a big plug. This is what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll tell you all a little bit more about Marc shortly, but first off, I'd just like to let you know that for today's webinar, you at home will be on mute and your video is turned off, so we can't see or hear you. So feel free to move around and chat amongst yourselves. We do encourage you to ask questions though. So if you'd like to ask questions, down the bottom, you can click on the Q&A button and type in any questions you have there. So they'll pop up on my screen. I'll check them as we go through and ask them to Marc on the way through, or we can cover those off at the end. I'd also just like to let you know that most of our conversation today will be about general financial strategies and insights. So I'm going to provide you with a general advice disclaimer. So that means that all that we're discussing today is general advice only. Even though most people on this webinar are clients of Evalesco at the moment, we're not taking into account your personal situation. So this webinar is not to be treated as personal advice. If you would like to discuss it further, please contact your advisor or give me a shout and we can delve into it a little bit further. So a little bit more about Marc. So Marc's been a financial advisor for over 30 years until very recently, when he has decided to focus his energies elsewhere, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Marc's also immediate past president of the Association of Financial Advisors and a passionate advocate of financial literacy. And as his book talks about, he firmly believes that every Australian deserves to retire comfortably and on their own terms. And that's why he's decided to stop advising and focus more about writing and spreading the good messages out of his book. So again, thanks, Marc. And maybe we'll start off with, what is the money sandwich?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was quite interesting when I was writing the book, and just like you would know, and most advisors, there's lots of the financial topics, savings, debt, shares, super, and all that. And I had sort of planned it out, but one of the really good pieces of advice I got early on was, who is your actual target audience? And people like using that buzzword avatar. And so it took me a long while to work that out, but really it was my own, it made sense to your own age group. So my age group, friends, peers were, and most of the clients for the last 10 years of advising were pre-retirees, people in their 50s and 60s. And one of the unique things about our generation, and why I've actually called it the sandwich generation, because most of us don't like being called middle-aged for a start, is that we have adult children and on one side, and we have elderly parents on the other. So there's the sandwich. And people say, well, isn't that always been the case? But really, this is the first generation that if you left school, once you left school, you usually have left home. But, financially, just due to different circumstances, people are studying more. And so millennials are definitely staying at home into their mid-20s on average now. So that's something very much different. And that's no previous generation has had to see how that works. And then on the other side of it, we have elderly parents, and people are living longer. When I was in my 20s, all four of my grandparents weren't around anymore. So that's something very different. And for my own millennial children, their grandparents are still around, and we just see that they just have a very different issues in that they nearly have to deal with aged care, estate planning, and just their own health with living longer. And you want quality, not just quantity. But a lot of that, especially helping aged care, and anyone who's in their 50s and 60s could probably relate, to try and deal with that whole aged care situation, or even just the psychology around dealing with your parents who say, the only way you'll get me out of my house is in a box. And so it takes a lot of your time and energy, and all at the same time, you're still seeing retirement on the horizon for yourself. So this sandwich generation, I thought, was pretty unique. They have their own money issues, but they're also trying to look at how they're going to help their millennial children get their first steps into the world and getting their finances in order, as well as helping their elderly parents. So the money sandwich.
Very good. Makes a lot of sense. It's been interesting just talking to some of our team and our clients about the book, and it's not a commonly understood sort of phenomenon yet, but once you explain it like that, it makes a lot of sense, and you can see. I'm sure there's people at home who are just going, "Oh, yeah, that's me for sure." And I know a lot of our clients I've spoken to, falling into that category as well.
Yeah, and just further is that a lot of the people that I turned to when I was researching the book was that they really didn't know there was anywhere to turn to. They didn't know financial advisors. We all experience this. Not a lot of people know what financial advisors do until they actually see a financial advisor. But there's aged care specialists out there. You don't need to do these things on your own. And a part of that book was explaining how to do it. But a lot of the parts of the book is actually also saying, do you really want to? There are people out there who can help you.
Yeah, no, that's a great message. And that's what I found having read the book. There's some, a great balance between the practical ideas of things you can do yourself or information which is helpful to learn, as well as then the steps that you can take yourself, as well as then, what might you do if you get to a point where you think you might want to reach out, and how do you go about doing that? Obviously, a lot of people, watching at home have already reached out to somebody in the Evalesco family and are getting some advice, but it may be some areas that they're just starting to come across that we haven't yet talked to them about in any detail. So, I think that the three sort of areas that your book focuses on is really helping kids get a start. It's helping parents as they age, and aged care is a big part of that. And then it's also making sure that you're on track for a comfortable retirement yourself for those people in their 50s and 60s. So I thought today, maybe a good way we just sort of break that down a little bit and talk about, what are some of the top tips or insights you've got for each of those segments, really targeted how people in their 50s and 60s can, I guess, take control and take some good steps in each of those segments. So starting with helping your adult kids get off to a good start. Getting into property is one that's commonly talked about. Australians, particularly in Sydney, people love to talk about property and how much their property is worth and how much it goes up. And it's on the front page of the paper every day. And even in the midst of a pandemic, there's still, property dominating the commentary. So, helping kids get into property is obviously a big one, and one that sort of raises its head fairly regularly. In your research and in your experience over 30 years, and I guess in some of the comments in the book, what are some of the key top tips or insights that you've got about helping kids to get into property and getting your adult kids underway financially in the right shape?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff, on that. It was a learning curve. Both my daughters in their 20s, and just speaking to their friends and seeing how they see property. And because I was always thought, well, for us growing up, it was always get your own home. You don't have to pay rent then. And that's your core basis for your home. But definitely people in their 20s, 30s, and even 40s are thinking very differently. They're sort of saying, first of all, 5 years from now, okay, we're under a pandemic, but 5 years from now, will I really even still be living in Sydney or Melbourne? I could be working from London, so do I really want to be tied down to a home 25-year mortgage? And so I sort of got that, but then on the flip side, they said, but we're still really interested in property. And so the way they see it, and it's a term they've only recently heard, rent vesting. And especially if they grew up in Sydney, for example, the area they may, inner city, North Shore beaches, wherever, they may not be able to afford, but that's where all their friends are. So they're quite happy for a lifestyle to actually pay rent as long as they've got something invested in the background that they can afford. And really, I've never seen more interest in it at the moment. And going to some local auctions, you can just see the amount of 20s and 30 somethings who are really looking at property for investment, but at a price they can afford. And what's really also interesting is that traditionally, when we used to see clients 20, 30 years ago, and they were talking about, well, I want to buy an investment property. I'm on a very high salary. I want the negative gearing. I want the tax deduction. And that all made sense. Negative gearing, your interest from your loan is higher than the rent you get. So there's a negative, there's a loss, and therefore that was tax deductible. But this is now 20-year-olds who are saying, well, interest rates are so low. And if interest rates are 2 or 3%, and I can get rent at 4 or 5%, I'm actually either positively geared or it works out to be neutrally geared. So I can actually get an asset growing in the background, which is really not costing me anything, not tying me down. I can still live where I want or move wherever I want, but it's growing. And eventually, once I decide where family, kids, and I do want to set roots somewhere, I can use that as now my deposit for the main property. So it's really good thinking, and it's definitely advisors are even changing the way they're thinking about how they talk about property, how investing, and interest rates being so low, and they will stay that way for the foreseeable future. There's just huge opportunity. So that's definitely a tip or an insight that I've seen. What I've also noticed is when I talk to my clients who are in their 50s and 60s, and I might ask them, well, what do they see as their main life goals or plans for the future? It might be that the husband, if it's a couple, say, yep, I want to have enough to retire comfortably. But from the wife's point of view, it's how do I help my kids get that first start in life? How could they ever possibly afford to buy into the Sydney or Melbourne market? And I think it's easier that, if they've got the asset of their own home, a lot of people are looking at, well, maybe I can help provide the deposit. So they can afford the loan, but if I can at least help them with the deposit or guarantor, and a lot of people say, oh, I don't want to be a guarantor because I don't want to be fully up for it. But what I've also learned is that bank guarantors for a home or domestic property compared to a business where you're up for the whole loan, bank guarantors for a home is actually only for the deposit. So it's very small, and there's lots of strategies that advisors are helping the sandwich generation help their kids get into their first property.
Yeah, that's great. So you're talking about things like family pledge loans where, when you've got good equity in your property rather than handing over cash or tapping into your super. And, we've had some conversations recently with some clients where, looking to help their kids rather than, pulling money out of their super necessarily, they can use their homes as a security, which is a great way of helping the kids, but also not putting their retirement in jeopardy. Because I think that's an important one. You've got to, put your own oxygen mask on first, make sure that your retirement's going to be secure and worry about that. I think the rent vesting one's an interesting one as well, because I think there used to be a bit of a thought process around, the stepping stones and getting on the property ladder and then climbing up that ladder as you wanted to get to your ideal family home. But the home that you might want to buy to live in could be quite different to what might be a good investment. So even if you're going on that stepping stone, you might be at cross purposes as to what's the right thing to do. Whereas if you take the view that where you're happy to rent for a period of time, as a lot of that younger generation are, you can be really focused on buying a property which makes sense from an investment viewpoint, and then use that to build your wealth.
Exactly.
And then when you find a home you want to live in and you work out what that is, that's a totally different conversation. So it makes sense as a investment decision as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. The other point that I really noticed for 20s, which was very different to when I was in my 20s, because we didn't have ATMs. So if you didn't get to the bank on a Friday afternoon, you were really having a tough time that weekend. Is easy money. So cash flow coaching, debt control is so important for 20 and 30-year-olds. People live paycheck to paycheck and very rarely have enough and to save at the end of the month. So tips around pay yourself first. Just having an account that you can use as your own salary, but have a separate account where all the big items are covered for it, and just the whole strategy around that, because people just need to feel in control. And that's it. And unfortunately, when most people talk about their expenses and they sort of say, well, I earn a decent income, I just don't know where it all goes. And there's plenty of help out there. I know you do a lot of work in that area. And if people get control and understand where their money is going, you can make decisions and you can see, and that's where, the basis, don't spend more than you earn. But it's that phrase is still as relevant today as it was 30 years ago.
Yeah. And that's where the people in the 50s and 60s can help their kids. I guess it's hard sometimes, kids don't always listen to their parents that much, but, giving them some good tips on, just starting to put a little bit of money aside on a regular basis as soon as you can. And, starting any amount that you start with is a good amount, isn't it? And just keep up those good habits. So moving to the opposite end of the spectrum then, talking about helping elderly people, so aged parents as they age, and getting them set up and looking after them, and getting them into aged care and those types of things is another important component that a lot of people are coming up against in that 50s and 60s age group. Now, I saw a article this morning, actually, a recent survey by the National Seniors Australia and Challenger claims that only 14%, which is around 1 in 7 Australians over 50, are financially prepared for their own aged care needs. So that's a pretty low number. Obviously, hoping when you're in your 50s, you're hoping you're still some way away from being ready for aged care. But the suggestion is obviously start the planning process sooner, and I know you agree with that. And you talk about in your book about the conversation. So I'll put in quotes, the conversation that you can have with your elderly parents. So, can you tell us a little bit about what is the conversation and your thoughts on how to approach the aged care needs?
Sure. And the interesting fact is that there's already more than 500,000 people who are over the age of 85. So people are living longer, and they do need to be prepared for it. And off the back of that, your investments do need to work harder for you, but that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
But I talk about the conversation because it was told to me, gee, that was probably 20 years ago, and I've had to have that in my own situation, and I know my friends are similar. There just gets to a point where, and it really is quite interesting, when you look at your parents healthy, traveling and all that, and then there just sort of comes a day when you just say, wow, they're just starting to look a bit frail. They're getting just not sure as they are. And it does transition to them being your parent, to you seeing, okay, I need to help them. So we call it the conversation, and I've, as an advisor, been able to help try and be a third party, because sometimes you do need a third party or a neutral person there, because a lot of times parents don't like talking to their sandwich generation children, the 50s and 60s, because I'm still the parent. I'm in control. It's all okay, and they just don't want to talk about it. Not aged care, not whether they have a will, whether it's updated, who's the power of attorney, who's the executors, all the sort of things that do need to be ticked off. And so we sort of say some tips on how to, have that, and you sort of maybe just bringing it up slowly. You know what needs to be done, and you're just sort of, okay, well, you don't need it now, mum and dad, but maybe 5 years, 10 years, if you do need to leave the house, and then they'll say, well, I'll never leave this house. But if you just do need to, you never know what's around the corner. What would you like? Where do you see, is there an age, is there a facility, do you want to be beside the beach? Do you want to, do you need something where you can be looked after for certain situations for health and that? And you just sort of, not sort of saying now, but you just need to breach that conversation. And also, by the way, when was the last time you've had your will looked at? Is there something, and actually it works in reverse, because I've seen situations where there may have been 3 or 4 adult siblings, and when the 3 or 4 adult siblings were sort of chatting and said, well, 3 or the 4 said, well, okay, when mum and dad move into an aged care home, well, they'll need to sell the house to pay for that. And that all makes sense. And the fourth sibling said, no, that's my family home. That's where I grew up in. You cannot sell the family home. So it's actually worthwhile to have those conversations, not just with your parents, but also with your siblings, just to see you're all on the same page. Because the last thing you want to do, and it's unfortunately the way it happens in normal circumstances, is that someone accidentally falls down. You break a hip, and it's your doctor saying, you're never returning back to your house. We've got to get you into aged care. And if it's at that point, you're racing around trying to find a place, you're not quite sure what your parents want, you don't know quite sure what your siblings all agree to. And so having that conversation, and whether that's 1 or 5 or done briefly, or you bring someone else in, because there's aged care specialists out there, financial advisors do this, who can help raise that topic. And sometimes even having a third party in there, and the adult siblings aren't there at all, just so the parents have someone they can talk to, and you feel as an adult, in my situation, that at least I know it's getting looked after. And eventually, they'll have a plan and a course of action. So it's really important to start those conversations early when they are healthy, because you just don't want to leave it too late.
Yeah. I think the aged care one's really an interesting one at the moment. There's, the Royal Commission into aged care last year, there's a fair stigma around aged care. And I think, to your point, there's often been that thought from people that they never want to move into one of those facilities anyway. And maybe that's been sort of re-stimulated a little bit with some of the horrible press and coverage from that commission. So I guess from that viewpoint, the earlier you start the conversation, and aged care is, moving into an aged care facility is an option, but it isn't the only option. But to your point, if you leave it to the time when you do break your hip and your doctor says, well, your option is you stay in hospital or, you go to a facility, then it becomes your only option, doesn't it? So having that conversation earlier, there's lots of, in-home services, there's lots of things you might choose to spend the money on, renovating, upgrading your home to make it more comfortable for you to live in. You might, have other options you can play with. But if you don't have that conversation, then you're never going to get to explore those.
And another thing that I found from the research was that if there is 4 siblings, 2 siblings, there usually is someone who is happy to step up, to be executor, to do this on behalf, because there's others who just say, no, I just don't want to think about it. And I get that. So whereas from a parent's point of view, they sometimes say, well, we want to be fair. So both of you are executors, and someone says, I don't want to do this, and the other one does. So I think from that side of it, you do need to have those conversations, because it just seems to be there's always someone. And that's where you can also have, well, I need to get good advice. And a lot of solicitors and advisors will say, yeah, I'm happy to be there and help guide you through the way. But yeah, if one sibling just definitely doesn't want to do that, you shouldn't force them to be a dual executor or both on power of attorney or power of guardianship, because it just causes problems later on. When one won't make a decision and the other one's desperate to make a decision. And so you just don't want to cause problems there.
Okay. That's great. So anyone at home, if you've got any questions, as I said, click on the Q&A button down the bottom of your screen and type away, and we'll get to those. So just in terms of in that conversation, so obviously aged care, or, what the wishes of your parents when they are no longer able to look after themselves is an important part of the conversation. You talked about estate planning. So what are some of the things, you rattled off a couple there, but just to clarify on those, what are the things that need to be discussed when we talk about estate planning to make sure that they're considered?
It's actually usually the little things, because if it's your home, most would say, I've got 2 siblings, you're going to split that 50-50. Straightforward, all the assets get realized, sold down and split 50-50. But then there's the emotional attachments to, here's my jewelry. And this particular piece I would like to leave to this person or this particular person for whatever reason. And it does cause problems. And I've seen where it's really split families. And so I think if parents want to, for whatever reason, leave something for someone and something to someone else, you just accept it. That's your parents. You want to do that. life's too short, and you get on with it. But it is really important for some of those emotional things that the children are really emotional, that painting that their mother did or something that they bought, that they have that they make those wishes expressed early rather than, well, no, that's going to someone else. And I just think that causes a lot of problems, not so much the bigger items. But also sort of going back to, you did actually say about the Royal Commission into elder abuse, and that's made changes for advisors so that, if you're looking after someone who's in their 50s and 60s and they say, oh, well, we'd like you, we trust you, we've had a long relationship with you, could you now look after my mother and father? Well, there's a lot of rules which basically say, no, you can't do that. And it's a shame because it takes a lot of trust for someone to say, to look after my mum and dad. And so for the one or two that unfortunately made it bad for everyone else, that the legislation was changed for, I do think it's a shame. But I think if you have your business or advice practice and you've got a range of advisors that can still be looked after, because I just think it's very difficult for anyone in that emotional situation saying, my mum and dad, they really do need help. They don't want to trust anyone. I trust you, and it's a big thing. I think we do need to do better, and I think that will ease up. But I also get why the elderly do need protection. I totally get that, but that's the rare occasion, not the norm. So I think anything that there's an emotional attachment to, people do need to write down. And people, when they fill out a will, the lawyer may just say, well, just list your main assets, and you just don't think of those little things. And people don't realize they just don't need to have a will. They can actually have a memorandum of wishes where they can just write things down, and that can be attached to a will. You just need to get it down. And if there's something you specifically want for a particular child or sibling, because there's some story behind that, it's important to list everything. And over time, just get all that done.
I think it's important that's not a set and forget document, is it? Because
absolutely,
things change, people change, your circumstances change. So updating that, it doesn't have to be updated every year, but updating that reasonably consistently as things change is something important as well. Okay. So we've just got a couple of questions and comments come through, which is great. So one from Andrew, he just commented, when his father retired, Andrew talked to him about investing in funeral bonds, and he wasn't so keen at the time, but recently his wife died and he was happy that it had all been paid for. So that's a really good practical piece of planning that is often overlooked or not fully considered. So that's an important part of that conversation as well, is how do you plan for final expenses, and what are your wishes around funerals and that type of thing, which I think is also important.
It's a great point. And from a physical point of view, you might say, this is where your mother is now buried. Well, you don't know how long your father's going to be living for, so prepaying for that spot beside her is important. And so there's things like that you do need to consider, and making an advance payment. So those sort of things are important, because you don't want to have where your mother is buried and have to then move 300 meters down the path to where your father is buried. So there's a lot of considerations there, and people should have those conversations. So it's a really good tip.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Now, next one coming in is there's a couple coming in about guarantors and for the children. The first one I'm going to ask you about, Mark, is your thoughts. This is about parents are convinced they're going to stay at home and have a live-in nurse, so they don't need a nursing home, and the full value, they won't realise the full value from the sale of their house. They're thinking about a reverse mortgage to pay for the care. And the question is this possible and a financially sensible decision? So reverse mortgages, I guess, came about probably maybe 10 years ago, and they weren't great initially. What's your thoughts on reverse mortgages and where they stand as a potential tool?
And that's often one of the examples people or parents will say, well, I could get a nurse in. You don't need to put me in, I don't need to go to an aged care home or some other retirement village. And I do think people, once they actually start looking at retirement villages, it's very different to what they were 20 years ago or 10 years. And there was a bit of a stigma, but some of these are luxury resorts nearly. So people really, once they see them, they say, well, absolutely, there's a whole new community of people I can mix with and socialize with. But when it comes to, okay, yep, that is a consideration. I wish to live in my own home and I'm asset rich but cash poor. So we see that. And reverse mortgages really did have a bad history, and they definitely have a bit of stigma around them because there was no limit on what they do. So the compounding effect that we help our clients in growing their money was actually working in reverse in growing the debt against your home. So they basically stopped because there were too many horror stories of people were losing their homes before they had even passed away. Because it'd eat up the whole value of the home. The government stepped in, made changes, I think probably 6 years ago now, and have set limits. So if you were to sort of saying 65 or 70 and you wanted to take out some money, there's only 5% or 4% that you're allowed to deduct from that. And there's only a certain amount it could ever go up to. So there's really strict legislation about that. So I actually do think it's actually a good example of someone who may not have enough in superannuation but have paid off this Sydney home and have got a lot of quite a significant asset. But it's really somewhere you'd get advice on. It's such a big thing. You're putting your home up for a mortgage, basically against it. And yes, it could really help you in that situation, but it's also probably not a long-term thing because there is going to be a point where you can't stay at home. And so that conversation still needs to be had, but definitely in the short term, if you don't really want to sell your house or don't wish to sell it until you do move into a retirement village or aged care, for example, there are a very good example, but do your research or get someone else to do the research, because while the legislation has changed, it's something still to be very wary about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my viewpoint, just, I guess echoing you saying there, Mark, I think reverse mortgages are an option, but I don't think they should be the first option. I think there's other things you can do, other ways you might be able to approach the problem, and that's where having to talk to somebody, getting advice can be really helpful to work out, I think also not tackling it in isolation. So that might solve one problem, but it might create other problems for you. So thinking about that as well. So we've got a couple of questions, 3 questions now, actually, which is great in a similar sort of area about helping when you're helping children get into property. So all sort of relating to, legal protection and guarantor status and that sort of thing. So a couple of them. So one of them suggesting if you can help people kids get into property, do you think you should make them get some insurance like income protection or mortgage insurance to help them protect against being able to keep up the mortgage repayments if they get sick? So I know what you're going to say on this one, being your background in insurance is an important part of your business as well. And I agree wholeheartedly, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, any good plan has a good safety net. Simple as that. And the safety net is either, if you don't actually have assets to cover that, we provide that safety net, it's insurance. A very, very low cost solution. And any debt, you wouldn't think of getting a loan on your car without getting some sort of insurance against your car. So why would it be any different for one of the biggest debts you'll ever have, which is against your own home? And people don't often think of what's their actual greatest asset. And really, it's your ability to earn an income. So if you're not actually insuring that, or looking at how, in case something happens and you're off work for 6 months, 2 years, or unfortunately permanently disabled, that mortgage, or you're not going to lose that house, you're not doing the whole picture. You definitely need to look at how you're paying that mortgage, how you're getting that mortgage. And also, the banks often say, if you're getting the mortgage to them, here, tick this box and automatically the mortgage covered insurance. But what you actually find is if you actually go and get some advice on that, for a lot less cost, you can get probably more comprehensive cover. And for a lot of people, one of those things is critical illness cover. And so for people, and people say, well, you know, you only worry about cancer, heart, stroke, and all those sort of things when you are in your 50s and 60s. But unfortunately, people do get cancer when they're in their 20s. People do have accidents, and it is the cheapest time you have that cover, and you can lock in those rates for the long term. So, you know, if you were having a mortgage, and there's probably 60 to 70% chance into 65, you are going to eventually have a heart condition, cancer, stroke. And the good thing is most people, 89% of people recover from these. But why wouldn't you insure that? You insure your house, you insure your car, so why wouldn't you?
Absolutely. I think it's even, so I think that's spot on, and it's vital. You definitely wouldn't go into it unless you had that safety net. But I also think just in general for, you know, people in their 50s and 60s with kids as they're starting to work, and to talk to them or have them talk to somebody about their own insurance needs, because a lot of people in that circumstance, if something happened to your kids, you would be there to back them up. But at what cost to your own plan? So we haven't even touched on securing your own successful retirement yet. But, you know, if something was happened to your kids at that age and they had some commitments and they didn't have the right levels of protection in place, then most people on this call would be in a position where they could help and they would want to help, but it might mean, you know, causing some damage to their own plan. So having that conversation and making sure that the kids are thinking about themselves is really important. Just on mortgage insurance, I think it's important to think mortgage insurance is something really that the bank takes out or makes you take out, but that's really to protect the bank. So mortgage insurance isn't going to protect you as the guarantor. It isn't going to protect your children as the borrowers. It's just going to protect the bank. So they need to take their own steps to get the right insurance in place to cover that off. Another question here from Mark on a similar note. If you lend money or go guarantor for a child, what legal protection should you have or take?
Yes, that's a tough one because it's your own kids. So I get that. But I actually still, even people saying, well, it's my children, of course, I don't need to get any legal document. I don't think it's a bad idea though. Even if it's just to see a lawyer, or as a minimum, get something just written down and you both sign it, just so that your children see the seriousness of what they're doing, of what your parents are doing and helping you out. Whether it stacks up, you know, that you're ever going to sue your own child for that is pretty well irrelevant, except in extreme examples, extreme cases. But having something down that, you know, having something written, I absolutely agree. And whether you go to see a solicitor to do that, I just think it's important for your children to understand what you're doing isn't something flippant, or this is a big commitment for both of you. But I also sort of see from examples where if you have a deposit and you are only guarantoring the deposit, within 2 or 3 years, hopefully that property has grown, and that's the first thing you get released. So I also see when people say, oh, I'm going to have this guarantor and it's going to be on there for the next 25 years. No, it's only until the property has grown so that the children have enough value in the house for their own 80% of the mortgage, for example. So I only see this as firstly, having something written down, but secondly, this is not a set and forget thing. This is in 2, 3, 4 years. You should need to have it reviewed with the bank and or your mortgage broker, because I do like mortgage brokers, and as part of the review process and getting it removed as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So Mark's just sort of followed up on that, and I think I can answer this to a degree. So if you're the guarantor, what you want to go guarantee for in this circumstance we're talking about is only that deposit. So if your child is buying a place, just to make my maths really easy, for $1 million, you only want to guarantee up to $200,000 as their 20% deposit. So hopefully they'll have some cash and they'll be able to put some money in, and you might go guarantor for less. But really, you're only wanting to guarantee that $200,000. So if something goes wrong, you're only exposed to $200,000. So, yeah, it's still a lot of money, but it's not that you're putting your whole family home on the line and the bank is going to come and sell your home. They're going to come and say, okay, you owe us $200,000. Where's that going to come from? They'll get the rest of their money from selling the other home, the child's home, if they need to get that paid back as well. So I think that's an important part of it. You don't want to go the full cross-collateralizing your properties, because that's exposing you to much more risk. So it's really limiting what you're exposing yourself to and only guaranteeing that amount, and making sure you've got an exit strategy that if something does go wrong, so whether that is, accessing your super, having some cash available, or selling another asset, which isn't going to put you at risk either.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think it's just sound advice that you actually go get advice. On a situation like this, it's amazing how many people will buy their biggest asset of their life and not get any advice. So the banks at one point used to say, you have to go get a solicitor, check out the mortgage. I'm not quite sure what the solicitor would ever do with a standard templated bank mortgage, because you've just got to accept that. But why wouldn't they have also said, you should go get some financial advice? Can you afford this? How is this part of your goals? And it is something that when we're part of the association, we were lobbying the government that these sort of things should be mandated. Over a $500,000 loan should get advice on this.
Yeah. So we've got actually two questions, but they're both very closely related, which is great. And that's probably going to put us out of time. We're not even going to get to talk about securing your own successful retirement. It's all about everybody else. So the question is, if children are interested in investing or purchasing an investment property, is there a need for asset protection given temporary nature of young people's relationships, de facto breakdowns, that type of thing? And then there was a similar question saying, can a document like you were talking about earlier, Mark, cover for those types of scenarios? I guess looking at the view where, if you're helping your children and then they shuck up with somebody, and then that separates, what is that person entitled to, or how can you protect your child and your contribution to that mix? Any thoughts on that?
We're not lawyers, so that's the first thing to say. And this is crossing over to sort of setting up trust and type of bloodline trust, so that these assets can be going down your bloodline, and regardless of whether you're married, de facto, get divorced, that they're continued. It's very difficult when it's your own home, though. Maybe it is an investment when it's your own home. And the family court, though, is very understanding and very practical in that they'll see if this is your property and eventually you get married or something like this, they will only recognize that person for that portion of time. So in most of those situations, you are fairly protected, your deposit's protected, the majority of that property is protected for your child. But if you really want to make sure, that's when you look at putting this under a trust, under a family type trust, and see a lawyer.
Yep. I think one other thing that we've spoken to some of our clients a couple of times is, thinking about if you're providing cash, which we haven't really talked about, but if you're providing cash to a child, make it a loan, so that you're lending them money, and you can determine what the terms of that might be. If that means in the event that they sell the property or a breakdown of a relationship, then you have to get your loan repaid first, so at least you're protected on your amount of money. Similarly with the guarantee that we've been talking about, that is actually a loan. So if there was a breakdown of that relationship, then before any assets are split, that loan needs to be repaid. So the bank needs to get their money back. You need to get your money back because you're guaranteeing that to the bank as well. So having a loan in place means there is that level that, it's formally documented already, and there's a process that needs to be undertaken. You can get into, things like prenups and that type of thing as well, which can be really valuable and have been tested in court. And again, we're not lawyers, so not going to tell you what should go in that, but that is something that you might want to consider if you're in a position where with your assistance or on off their own bat, your child is entering a relationship with significantly more assets than their partner. We all go in with the rose-colored glasses and hope that it's going to end well. But having those conversations is also something you can do to consider, that protection as well. So we're about 1 minute before our scheduled finishing time, and as I said, we didn't even get to talk about securing your own successful retirement. But I guess we've got a fair bit of information on our website, and then you can go to Mark's book to read more about that and come back to us with questions at any time. Have you got any final comments, Mark, that you would like to sort of make about anything we've talked about today, or anything about your book?
Sure. two things probably. When you retire, it's not just about financial freedom. That's important. You know, a bit like your own tagline, wealthy, healthy, and happy. You need to worry about your own health, your relationships, and what is your next big challenge. It's not just retiring and then sitting on a couch and watching Oprah. Even though that ages me a bit. So you definitely need to get all those things looked at, and advisors are getting better at that. And a bit from my own reason for the retirement coaching and the book and the website is that for a lot of your people watching, you know, they're looked after and all this, but they may know people who, the average person retiring in Australia at 67 couple only has 420,000 in their super. So there's a lot of people out there who can't actually afford advice, or not sure what advisors do. So that's really where my book is positioned, and my website, to try and help those that either are getting to a stage where they may be able to go seek advice, but at least have somewhere to turn to if they're not quite ready at this stage. So probably that's my final point. Yeah.
Perfect. Great place to wrap up. So, yeah, if you do want to follow along and get some more information, or steer your friends in the right direction, you can go out and buy the book, which is The Money Sandwich by Marc Bineham, or the website, which is themoneysandwich.com, which has a lot of great tools, some good blogs, and some fantastic information about where to go for next steps. Also, of course, talk to your advisor at Evalesco, and we can steer you in the right direction, you know, for your friends or for yourself, to, you know, get some help with your own retirement needs, as well as having those conversations with your kids and with your parents potentially. So thank you very much, Marc. Really enjoyed the conversation. We got fantastic questions from the audience, which was good. So showed we're obviously on the mark there with some of the topics, which I know you already know, because that's why you wrote the book and spent time doing that. But yeah, thank you for your time, and congratulations again on the book. I really enjoyed it. I think it's fantastic, easy to read, and if anyone would like a copy of the book, then you can get one via themoneysandwich.com, or get in touch with us, and we'll be able to hook you up as well.
And get it signed if they want.
Yeah, I've got mine autographed here, of course. So yeah. That was in pre-lockdown days. I was able to catch up with you in person, so that was great. But thank you to everybody at home. Hope you found that interesting and valuable. You'll be receiving a copy of the recording via our newsletter, which will be coming out this afternoon, and it'll also be up on our website. So look out for that. And we'll be coming back to you next month with another exciting installment of the Evalesco webinar series. So in the meantime, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Marc.
Thanks, Jeff.